Hello, welcome to your narrated PowerPoint because we had to cancel class due to the snowstorm. Last night's class was going to talk about children living in poverty. So, as you may know from your readings, your textbooks, and the article I signed, more than 1 in 5 children, almost 1 in 4 actually, live at or below the poverty threshold. I'm sure you recall what that means when people live above or below the poverty line. But if you're looking at children that just live in low-income families and you double the poverty line, then you're talking about almost half of American children. And we talked about the effects of poverty on children and adults last week, but there's a couple more things I've added here. Cognitive development, and so when children live in poverty, their cognitive development and how they think and how they remember things is affected. And studies show that children that live in poverty don't do as well academically and cognitively as children that don't live in poverty. There's a number of reasons for that, and we'll actually talk about brain development. The brain is developing a great deal up until the age of 5. It doesn't stop developing, but some major changes go on during those first 5 years of development. And when children experience stress, or they don't get the adequate nutrition they need, or they're exposed to environmental toxins, or their physical or mental health is compromised, then their brains just aren't able to develop fully to the best extent as though it could if they didn't live in poverty. Another one is nutrition. I don't think we talked about nutrition last week, but children that live in poverty are more likely to face nutritious deficits, and so they don't get the adequate nutrition that they need. The movie that I assigned, Children Living in Poverty, you'll see how a couple of those children talk about having to eat like frozen pizza all the time, and how that's not, money can buy that and feed the family, but it's not a nutritious meal, and when children are still developing, they need those nutrients. Everyone does, adults do too, but children particularly. And you may or may not know that the negative effects of poverty on children are much worse on kids under the age of 5. And that's the group that's hit the hardest. The most amount of children in age group living in poverty are actually under 3. And so it's something we really need to focus on fixing in this country. Effects of poverty on children, mediators. So what I mean by this, and I've done this in class before, and I really want you guys to give some thought to this because you have to learn how to think critically about issues. So when you look at the relationship between poverty and poor grades, what is something that could explain how poverty affects poor grades or causes children in poverty to get poor grades? Well, I mentioned it earlier. Could be the environment, could be nutrition, could be poor mental health. There are other things that explain that relationship. And we call those mediators or extraneous variables, things that help explain how A turned into C, if poverty was A and poor grades were C. I've given some other examples here. Poverty and developmental outcomes. And so we talked about brain development and factors that are common among children living in poverty, and it could be those variables that actually explain that. So even children from affluent families, if they lived in an environment where they were exposed to lead paint, let's say, or they weren't getting the adequate nutrition they needed, then they would also experience poor developmental outcomes. So it's not money per se, but the factors that poverty cause for families that result in the negative outcomes. Poverty and fewer friendships, we talked about why that may be the case. So what could explain that relationship? And again, it's the give and take of you stay at my house, I'll stay at yours. Children may be ashamed of their situation. They may be made fun of in school. And the reasons they're made fun of may be because of poor hygiene or because they don't have the popular clothes and toys. And poverty does explain how that is the case, but It's really those factors that cause the fewer friendships. And then poverty and poor mental health, thinking depression and anxiety, like what kinds of things. If you, in the movie Poor Children, you see that little girl, I can't remember what her name is, but she talks about how she is depressed, and how it's hard, and look at their life every day and the struggles they face. It's those factors that cause poor mental health, not lack of money per se, although lack of money leads to those conditions. I hope this makes sense to you guys. I'll touch base on it again next week just to make sure. So one thing we need to remember is that assistance actually comes to children through their caregivers. And so we provide support for children living in poverty, but in order to get that support to the children, we have to give it to the caregivers. You can't hand a 5-year-old $300 for temporary assistance for needy families and say, this is the money that you need for this month. Go ahead and use that to help support your family. Obviously, caregivers are the ones that would receive the money. And I think that a lot of people tend to forget this. They focus on the adults that are getting the assistance, but the reason they're qualifying for that assistance at all is because of the children in their household. It's very unlikely that people qualify for a great deal of assistance if they don't have a disability and they're not elderly, if they don't have children. And so the biggest recipients or group of recipients of assistance are children. So the first one, TANF, I just gave an example with that. That's referring to cash assistance. So getting cash every month to help pay bills from the government. SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It was formerly called food stamps. They changed the name to focus more on it being a supplement and a nutritious supplement. The school lunch and breakfast programs, some of the most successful anti-hunger programs that we have in this country. Head Start preschool programs allow children that are living in homes that are disadvantaged to get literally a head start to try to catch up to their more affluent peers. After school care programs like Teen Reach. You may be familiar with Teen Reach here in Charleston, which does offer programs for anywhere, I think, from age 9 to maybe 16 or 17. Not entirely positive about that. But it does target most, if not all, of that age group, and allows the children to have a place to do their homework and to participate in activities, educational experiences, etc. And then subsidies, which is just additional money or some type of discount, or the government comes in and picks up the bill for the rest. For housing, for childcare, transportation, heating. For housing, it may work that the family only has to pay 30% of their income for housing, and the government comes in with the rest, regardless of how much it costs, if people qualify for that. Again, remember, it's the children really that are qualifying, but you can't have children living alone. And then free health insurance. So literally every single child in the USA is eligible for free health insurance. And most do access this, but there is a small percentage that don't. And it does talk about that in the low-income children article. And there are a number of reasons for that we'll be talking about all semester. One of the biggest ones is either parents don't know or their pride. They don't want to take a handout. Okay, children in other developed countries, you may or may not have been aware that children from other developed industrialized countries that can be compared to the United States, so they're industrialized, they're developed just like the USA, they fare better, or they do better than children from the USA when it comes to poverty, when it comes to health, when it comes to well-being, and socialization. So all things held equal, as far as being a developed, industrialized, or wealthy country, children don't do as well here in the US as they do in other developed countries. And there are a number of reasons for that. One, other countries tend to have better and stronger safety nets. Safety nets refer to those programs we were just talking about, as well as other forms of resources and support for disadvantaged families. And so other countries tend to have more families that qualify, they provide aid longer, and they give more aid than the United States. The second reason is that other industrialized countries have a more community-focused viewpoint versus an individualized viewpoint here in the US. And so other countries recognize that if they take care of everyone, they're taking care of themselves too. And that if anyone is in poverty or anyone is suffering, then everyone is affected. The United States is more individualized and more about taking care of your own family, working hard, getting ahead, but not so much worrying about everybody. So if you think about the programs that are developed with those two focuses, you're of course going to see the community-focused programs be much more broad and strong compared to an individualized focused program. There's a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. So 1% of the United States owns almost a third of the wealth in the USA. And we're actually going to look at a little movie clip on that later on this semester and how that, because it's kind of, I know it's a little confusing. But basically what we're saying is that 1% own a great deal of this country compared to the other 99%. And that gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger every year. The bigger that gap is, the harder it is for families to get out of poverty and to even move into middle class. So if the smaller the gap, the easier it is to get out of poverty and move into middle class or even become wealthy. And other countries have a much smaller gap. Other industrialized countries, not underdeveloped. Then there's the beliefs about poverty. So Americans tend to believe that people are rich because they're smart and they work hard. And that people are poor because they're lazy and lack morals. Other developed industrialized countries believe that people are poor due to circumstances often beyond their control, and that people are rich due to the situations or circumstances they're born into, luck, and other types of advantages that have come their way. So recognizing that if a child is born into wealth, it is likely they are going to be wealthy because they have lots of support from many different areas within the family. Somebody that's born into a family that doesn't have anything, it's much more difficult. They're starting from ground zero, where somebody that's born into a wealthy family may, when they become of driving age, they get a car, they get help with college, they don't have to take out student loans, have access to health insurance, etc. So that they're not starting at the same ground as people that live in poverty. But the big thing to remember about this is that people from other industrialized countries recognize that the rich aren't just rich because they're smarter or that they work harder, but that there are other circumstances that allow this to happen. These are some questions that I want you to think about when it comes to the midterm. These are the kinds of questions that I like to ask. So there are questions that ask you to think critically about issues. And when we say think critically, I'm talking about thinking about both sides of the issue or all perspectives. And so not just your own perspective, which is easy to put on paper and to think about, but also the other side. So what do you think your opponents would say? So why do you think Americans are willing to provide free health insurance for children, but not their caregivers? And so parents don't have access to free health insurance, but their children do. And so how does that work? What if their caregivers are sick? How are they supposed to care for the children, etc.? So I'm wanting to know what you think about that. So think about all the reasons why that might be. And then 2, how does this policy decision affect children? And 3, even with the safety nets the U.S. has in place, children still live in poverty and still face the risk of negative outcomes. Do you think that more programs are needed? And if you do, what kinds of programs? So, what else could be done besides what's currently being done?